Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Neurodiversity Salon. Today, it's called Multilingual Communications with Signers and Non-Signers. The Neurodiversity Salon and my university, Chiba Institute of Technology, are doing this as a collaboration. And the Neurodiversity Salon is a bilingual project to try to promote the idea of neurodiversity across Japan and connect with common people around the world and try to contribute to the global movement. And with neurodiversity, we include any kind of difference in people's brain. And we are trying to change the culture around this, as well as learn about different practices and systems and sensibilities. And I'm Joe Ito, by the way, and part of the Neurodiversity Salon community and the director of the Center for Radical Transformation at Chiba Institute of Technology. And my guest today is Christine Sun Kim. I've known her for many years. She was a director's fellow at the Media Lab at MIT, and she was one of my most inspirational director's fellows and one of the most inspirational people I've ever met. She is a deaf sound artist, which is in itself a very interesting and curious occupation she will tell you about. But for me, she's been a huge teacher. She came to the Media Lab and opened up our eyes to the whole deaf community, to sign language, to a completely new sensibility, and really transformed our lab, our students, and MIT. At the time, MIT didn't have a sign language class, even though it's such a major language. And with Christine's inspiration, our students lobbied for and got a sign language class at MIT. And she completely changed the way we do events and the way we think about accessibility, and did it in a very stylish way with flair and fun. And it was very much a needed input for our community. We also had kids around the same time. So we've been talking a lot about raising our children. And so it's one of the other working with Christine, the mother, has also been quite interesting in thinking about neurodiversity for our own children as well as society. So, and then she's also, last but not least, a brilliant artist, and that will be one of the pieces of her presentation, and it's extremely inspiring for me as well. So, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Christine. One thing that schedule-wise, we'll have Christine give a presentation first about her work, and then we'll have a little bit of a discussion, and then we'll open up to questions. So please be prepared to ask questions in chat. So thank you, Christine.
Thank you so much, Joy, for that introduction.
Oh, and sorry, one last thing. We have a very sophisticated translation system that Christine suggested to us. So we have American Sign Language, Japanese Sign Language, English interpreters audio, and Japanese audio interpreters. And this is also just as a accessible and exciting experiment with technology and translation, tremendously valuable. And hopefully we can use this kind of process to be more inclusive in other talks as well. Thank you. Sorry, please continue.
So thank you again for that introduction. It's so good to see your face. I'm so happy to be working with you on this. For the purposes of the audience, I'm going to pause throughout my presentation just to ensure that we have the translation process completed, being mindful of 2 to 3 languages here. I will go ahead and start sharing my slides now. Okay, great. I see you nod. Give me one moment to set up here. I'm just getting some feedback that that's not a full screen, black screen for my slides. And now I've gotten confirmation that I do have a full screen. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to share a few signs in American Sign Language, because those signs are how I connect to my work, whether that's through music or the deaf experience or something else. Like Joy said, like a mother, or as a deaf person, or as a woman. Maybe as somebody who's an American living in Germany. So there's a lot of reasons why I use signs in my work. In American Sign Language, the sign for score is like this, as in a musical score. Sorry, I'm watching the Japanese Sign Language interpreters. Do I have that right? Score? Ah, okay. So I've used this sign to show the sound of temperature rising. So you see the notes at the bottom. This is very Western music style. These are whole notes, full notes. And then as you get to the top, as the temperature is rising, they become quarter notes, which communicate a sense of urgency. So the temperature is going up, and I show that sound also can be emotions. Sound can be feelings. Sound can show time. Sound can be a temperature. It can be a chair. It can be a table. Sound isn't just what you hear, right? But sound can be many things. So to sign turn taking in ASL indicates that there's two of us, yes, and that we take turns between us. So this is one person, two person on the fingers. And then this is my turn. And then it becomes your turn. And then my turn. And then your turn. And that's how we communicate turn taking in ASL. Okay, I see the Japanese sign. And so you can see that this is in the fashion of a clock. So it goes from your turn, my turn, your turn, my turn, to communicate a sense of time. And that's commentary on social justice, about activism, about taking action. As we all know, society is obviously designed without people like me on their mind. They don't consider somebody like me. So why is it always my turn to fight, to protest, to ask for rights? I need it to be society's turn. I need them to do some of the work. Then it can be my turn again. I'm okay with that. But it's important that we share responsibility, because that's healthy. It's important that we do all this work together. Now I'm showing you a billboard that was up in New York City. This must have been in the year 2018, which was my first billboard. But it's actually changed my practice. I've had a lot of work become outside, a lot of public work, and it all started with this billboard. The title in English, this says here, Too Much Future. Because the sign in ASL for future is like this: future. One more time. Mhm. And so when you follow that sign, you can make a line. I've made that line thick, too much. Mhm. And I've increased the thickness of the line in order to create space for optimism about the future, anxiety about the future, tiredness about the future, excitement for the future, hopefulness. I wanted to hold space for the human experience. And also to talk about activism again. I would think all major cities, including New York City, are worried or are preoccupied maybe about what's next, what's hot, right? And the future comes very quickly for everyone. Now I'll introduce another sign, and this is the sign for echo. And you have one hand be the surface, and the other hand is sound, moving against the surface, bouncing off, creating an echo. And so what I've done is shifted that direction to meet this room. So the echo hits the floor instead of the wall. And it keeps bouncing off these four surfaces of the room. So where does the echo go? It doesn't, it stays. And this shows that old ideas that stay, that won't change, that won't have any flexibility. It's a commentary on ableism, or anyone who's not like me in power doesn't make room for somebody like me to be a part of society. Here's a video so you can see the full room. And sorry, I didn't use the right angle on my phone to film. So, as you recall, I have the painting in that room and I've changed the direction again. I've taken that echo trap, as I call it, and put it down on paper. So now the paper edges are where the echo hits. And so it hits one part of the paper, another part of the paper, and gets trapped. And I'll do this in my practice. I'll take a concept and I'll kind of use it in different ways, or I allow for a shape to change on different mediums. So this says hand palm, like the sign for echo. So hand, as you can see, I'm showing you here. Palm is on the inside of your hand. So hand palm. So another practice, oh, thank you. So another practice that I have incorporates the idea of motion lines in maybe manga or comics in the US. They're always so good at showing that through drawings. You can see the degree of impact or how loud something is or how much physical exertion, how heavy something is. So here you can see the baseball bat. So is this swing a light swing or is this a heavy swing, right? And you can see through these motion lines And I thought a lot about this practice in comic books. And then another museum in New York called Queens Museum, which is in the borough of Queens, which is one of 5 boroughs in New York. I can't remember, but they have maybe a few hundred different languages in this one small borough. I think it has the most languages of any space place in the world. And at one point during the pandemic, it became the epicenter of the pandemic. So it was the worst place in the world for COVID at one point. I was also at that time thinking about capitalism and its effects, how the healthcare system in the US is not great. Obviously, people don't come first in capitalism. And so I was trying to think of a one-line poem consisting of a few words that would communicate my feelings about this. I decided to choose signs that require the sign touching the body because some signs do and some signs don't. So I wanted signs that touch the body, and I'll show you now the 5 signs. This is time, and we show it like this, time. So I envisioned the lines matching that. This is owe, like you owe me time, you owe me money, right? Owe. So time owes. Me. So I pictured that impact. Me. This is my favorite one. Rest. Think about it. If you hit your shoulders very hard, they land and you have that impact cloud. Rest. Again. So the poem is Time Owes Me Rest Again, which is up to your interpretation for what that exactly means. I've seen a lot of my American friends, American family, tired, they're overworked. They have to have 2, 3 different jobs, and they still don't have enough healthcare. So this actually became my biggest mural that I've ever done to date. And here are some pictures to show the scale of how big it is. Now I took these line drawings of mine and turned them into a video, and I happened to be talking to Joy at that time. And he was saying that he could help me get into NFTs. And I thought that was an interesting idea, but I was a little bit nervous. I mean, any new technology for me is not something I adopt right away. I'm kind of slow to adapt. And thanks to Joy's support, I did do this, and I'm really happy I did. I still have a lot of questions about NFTs, but it's nice to see. It's nice to be able to get and create my own value on the blockchain. That's an interesting concept for me. And when I think about AI and all the advancements, it's an interesting place to be for me. Now, I'll show you the animations of the videos for the NFTs. So this headline came out a year ago in the New York Times. And we keep raising our national debt in the US. I feel like we're screwed. And so I took that word debt and I've thought about it. And if you recall my mural, Time Owes Me Rest Again. Well, when you owe something too much, it becomes debt. And it's not just about money. It can be social responsibility debt. It could be debt of owing me a good education. Society could owe me just basic, simple rights that I don't enjoy all the time. So I've been thinking about debt and what debt means. So recall my mural, and I've taken parts and incorporated it into other work, like I did with Echo. So I thought about again, oh, again, those signs and those line drawings. It becomes debt on loop over and over, again and again. So this title is Monthly Dues, meaning you owe things every month. And I have 12 of these drawings to be the 12 months of the year, right? So every month you owe rent, your mortgage, your phone bill, maybe schooling fees, things like this. This shows that you could just owe debt from anywhere. It's not just, again, about owing money, it's also about owing favors. Hey, if I do this for you, will you do this for me? You also owe support. You could owe attention. Hey, pay attention to me, right? Or I support you and you support me. It's not just about money. So a lot of my work borrows from memes, maybe a little bit here and there. But memes borrow from other things too, right? It's a way to take one concept and apply it to something else. One meme in its format can become applicable to endless ideas or concepts. So this was about how you hold your cigarette and what that tells people about yourself. If you hold it this way, you're this. If you hold it that way, you're that. And this one was, which philosopher are you like? So this is my drawing. And I titled it, How Do You Hold Your Debt? Right? The previous picture was, How Do You Hold Your Cigarette? I turned that into holding your debt. In the beginning of my career, I really didn't like the idea of including hands, literal drawings of hands. I felt like it was too referential or too much of what people expected. I'm deaf. I sign. Of course, I draw hands. No. But now I'm years into my career and I feel like it's safe. People know my work. Now I can move on and now I can work with hands in my pieces. So here I've shown 8 ways to hold debt based on my personal experience from things I've seen. So you can see that it's holding the debt in different ways based on the signs. And I'll read now all 8 examples. Childcare, mortgage, taxes, credit card, student loans, health insurance, utilities, rent. So this is a new piece that I did in LA at the Museum ICA LA, Los Angeles. This piece is titled Bounce Back. So historically, loans were intended to help people better their lives. So the idea historically in the US is that you would borrow money to set up a business, a new business that would make your life better. But that's transformed now. Now loans have high interest rates, you get trapped by them. There are loan sharks who use you as a way to make money and you don't better your life that way. And so you can't bounce back, as we say. And this is how it ended up getting painted. And this is my sister and her friends. We call it her squad. She is the second person on the left. Probably has the biggest and brightest smile of everyone. Proud sister. So this drawing speaks to narratives, and we see narratives out there on TV, in movies, in the news. There are stories about people. Do you remember the sign me? And remember I made that impact cloud in that mural. Well, now I've changed it. And in this drawing that I'm showing you, it uses the word finger. And the other word is palm, which I'm showing you. So it's a way to say my in ASL. That's my. This is me. So with the finger, the sign is me. And with the palm, the sign is my. So is it me or is it my story? And this is the sign for narrative. And whenever narratives are out there about deaf people, about Asian Americans, any of my identities, I'm always in a minority group. And because of that, the narratives are often about me, but they're not really my narrative. People are telling narratives about me, but not asking me to share my narrative. And there's tension there, right? Okay, you're telling a story about me, but why can't I just tell my story? And so these are my questions about narrative. So this is a project that I did with my husband, who is also my collaborator. His name is Thomas Matter. And through our relationship, Tom has seen what exists in the deaf culture. And then we've also become parents together. And so we've had to think about how to get somebody's attention. Now, in deaf culture, if you have a big hand like this, your full hand, hey, right, that shows that you're a little frustrated usually because you're trying to get their attention. Hey, hey, and then the more frustrated you get, the smaller your hand moves, right? Ah, listen to me. So that's about trying to get someone's attention in deaf culture. And then we also thought about how do you bring somebody's attention to something? Like if I want you to look over there, like look at my coffee, look, you point. And if they're not looking, look, right? You start pointing more hard and quicker and smaller. And now we are parents. So our kid wants our attention a lot, right? We need to get our kids' attention too. Sometimes when she wants my attention, she just taps one part of my shoulder, which is maybe more sensitive now than the other parts of my body. And it feels like she's dug a hole in my shoulder because she taps it so much. And that's what we're showing with this rock here. You can see the impact. We chose the color red because in the US, stop signs are the color red, and that gets drivers' attention. So you can see we have the pointer finger and the palm. And for this presentation, all my sound is muted, but the only sound you hear is basically a fan. Like in the US, to sell cars, they have inflatable men that flap around. And so this is the same sound. So a fan blowing air. So this is the last piece that I'll be sharing for this presentation. I've mentioned my daughter. Her name is Rue, Roux in English. Oh, you spelled it. Okay, great. And I was talking to her about how a musical score works because I was working on a project where I needed empty scores, so just lines, no notes. And my daughter Rose said, "Okay, mom," and walked away and decided to draw notes on an empty score. And her notes have hearts and actual notes and things like this you can see in the drawing. And when she finished, she told me that this was a song about family. And I said, "Oh, that's so nice, Rue." And now, just for context, I'm here in London, England for an art residency. And I noticed there was an empty flagpole where one hangs a flag outside of the institute where my residency is. And what's funny is that empty flagpole is right above a restaurant named Berlin, where I live in Germany. So we decided to do a residency flag, right? Like a family doing a residency lives here. We wanted to announce it to everybody walking by. And this is what it looks like. So I added 3 times a day, but it really looks good. This is Rue's score with notes. You know, my daughter has always seen my work, my husband's work. He's also an artist. So she always goes to art openings and exhibitions seeing our work. But this is the first time that she can see her work when she walks by. And part of the reason why we did this is because a lot of art institutions around the world have not made room for people with families. And so this flag is our comment on that. And that's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine. It was a wonderful presentation. So I'm going to ask you a few questions. Is the translation and interpreting going okay? Okay. Okay. So first question is just to the extent you're willing to share, can you tell us a little bit about how you grew up and how you became an artist and what your inspirations and challenges were? Maybe.
Sure. So my parents and my sister moved to the US 1 year before I was born. So it's not just that I have a disability or deaf experience. I also have the experience of my parents being immigrants and going through that transition. They too had to learn English coming to this country. And when they moved to the US, it was from Korea. So that had a huge culture shock. This was in the 1980s that they moved to the US. And there were, at that time, a lot of educational theories being tested on deaf children. And all of this testing basically was done by hearing teachers. And a lot of these educational pedagogies and approaches ultimately failed. They did not succeed. I feel fortunate. I feel lucky because my sister is also deaf. So, because the two of us are deaf, my parents decided to learn American Sign Language as well. And to me, that decision was an act of love. I met a Korean friend years ago, and he said, "You know, Christine, I can tell that your parents really love you just by meeting you." And I realized that that's true. The simple fact that they decided to learn sign language shows that, because it impacts how I communicate within my family and within my communities. I have a lot of deaf best friends. And the ability to communicate with my parents in sign language and having friends who I can communicate with in sign language has afforded me the opportunity to be my truest self. Ultimately, I moved to New York City and decided I wanted to be a full-time artist and make a living from making art. When I moved to New York City, I also realized that it wasn't just my deafness that was a challenge, but also my ADHD, my attention disorder. It required me to have things be repeated over and over again. And I think that being deaf and also having ADHD has gotten me to this point. This is how I've met people like you, Joy.
Um, just one small side thing, because I think many people here are new to sign language. And it was a kind of an obvious thing to me once I heard it, but you mentioned having to learn a new language. And can you describe a little bit how sign language in different countries work and what that means, and how close is sign language to the words of the language versus the symbols?
Sure. First of all, I'm sure you just saw the two JSL interpreters switch.
Mm,
That's normal.
mm,
And it's normal because oftentimes the information that's being interpreted is quite dense. And so you need to switch between colleagues to ensure that there aren't that many errors or mistakes, or eventually people's brains get too tired and they start missing things. So that's why it's important to have two interpreters. Now, Joy, if you remember from the conferences, I would be very participant in conferences. And so for me, it's even better to have three interpreters because, as you might remember, Joy, I like to talk all day, all night. In a dream world, I would have four interpreters. I can be very expensive.
I remember, so I remember at TED, Christine was at a party dancing and running around with an interpreter chasing after her. So I can imagine why she needs three.
That's very true. But so to answer your question, there are different sign languages for every country. Even in English speaking countries, so they have the same spoken language, the sign language is still different. Because you have to remember, sign language is older than technology. Sign language has been around for hundreds of years before technology. And so deaf people are isolated. Deaf people didn't have ways to travel to each other. So a deaf British person would never really be able to meet a deaf Australian, even though their countries speak the same language. A lot of sign languages around the world don't have support from their governments. A lot of sign languages around the world are oppressed. A lot of sign languages aren't able to be used in deaf education. And a lot of sign languages are new. A lot of sign languages aren't as deaf or connected to the deaf community as they could be, and instead are more connected to the spoken language of the country. In the US, our sign language is connected to French sign language, believe it or not. It's not based off of a British sign language. So because we follow the French language, a Romantic language, we have different word order than English, which is a Germanic language. So a lot of the sign languages around the world also require a lot of facial expression use, because that indicates the mood, tonality, in the way that somebody speaks with emotion. We put that emotion on our faces.
I can't remember the specific examples, but Christine, I think you shared with me kind of how you say things in different languages, comparing how a Japanese sign language person might say something, and it's much more complicated, for example, than how you say it in English. But maybe you can share some examples contrasting how different countries say things in sign language.
Sure. So my favorite is the word drunk, when you've had too much to drink. And maybe I saw it. Oh, I thought it was one eyeball moves. Oh, now it's to the side. Okay. Because somebody taught me the JSL sign, one eye. Oh, okay. So that used to be the old sign. So now this is drunk, but we have drinking and then you miss your mouth. You're drunk, right? But it was interesting. So we think more about the drink that you have in your hand and how that contacts your mouth in ASL. But in JSL, it's more about the eyes and where your eyes are going. But it is still all about it on your face, right? It's not about your body. Or here's the word thank you in ASL. Thank you. But in Japanese, it's arigato. So in ASL, thank you is on our face. In Japanese, arigato is on the hand, which is different. So those are two examples.
Thank you. I used to enjoy our ASL lessons, and I miss hearing them. And I think to your point about the facial expression, I think it's really interesting also to see different ASL depending very much on the person's personality. And, I'll share the video later, but watching you do the national anthem during the Super Bowl was extremely emotional, and I think many people cried. But I'm curious, on the Super Bowl, how did you end up doing ASL at the Super Bowl? And did you practice? It's almost like a dance, right?
Good question. So in the US, we have the National Association for the Deaf, NAD. And every year, NAD chooses 1, 2, 3 people to perform at the Super Bowl. So somebody is chosen to perform the national anthem at the beginning of the game. And starting this year, now they choose a performer for the halftime performance as well. Now, the Super Bowl that I performed at was in 2020, right before the pandemic started. So what a year. I remember being in the stadium seeing, thousands of people, and then a few weeks later being trapped in my home because the world had locked down. When NAD asked me to perform the national anthem, I wasn't sure whether I was going to say yes or not. It's a very political decision, and they only play part of the national anthem when you perform it, because other parts of the national anthem are racist. It was written at a time when the US didn't believe that that was maybe a problem as much. So I had to figure out how to deal with that translation of the part I was going to perform. I worked on that for about 3 to 4 months. I performed my translation at home, sent it to NAD for their approval. I also enlisted some deaf friends of mine who are talented and who maybe have better ASL than I do for their feedback. Because poetry and storytelling in the deaf community is a really big thing. It's a crucial part of our culture. So when it was time to go to the Super Bowl, we had rehearsal 2 days before the event. And I got nervous. The interpreter who's with us here today, Beth, was also there with me at the rehearsal. And when the rehearsal was happening, we realized that we needed some way for Beth to cue me so that I knew to stay in time with the singer, because singers like to change their notes and hold their notes. So you see a video of me performing looking like I'm perfectly in time, but that's because Beth is next to the camera cueing me, telling me to hold that note, to stop, next note, things like this. Now, I've never interpreted a song before, so the national anthem was my first and my last. I'll never do it again.
So you mentioned the Deaf Association NAD, and also just kind of talked about social justice in your art description. But I'm curious, what is the deaf community and what are its politics and challenges and activities? I'm curious.
So I can use the American deaf community, which I can comment on, and kind of compare it to my life as an American living in Germany. And what I will say is there's one person whose name you absolutely need to know. And this person is Alexander Graham Bell, who is, as we know him, the man who invented the telephone. His mother and his wife were both deaf. He is somebody who did not believe in sign language as a language for deaf people. And because of his wealth and because of his fame in inventing the telephone, he was able to convince a lot of hearing educators that sign language wasn't best for deaf people, especially in education, and that instead deaf people should be taught spoken language and have oral education around the world. And he succeeded. His ideology is still very present to this day. And he made that shift in the year 1880, right? And it's over 100 years now. And that's kind of fundamental to understanding at least the American deaf community, because deaf children used to have access to sign language education and less so now. But there is an increase in sign language education. I will say, when I think of the future, I'm not as hopeful as I can be. The deaf community at large has a lot of people who are late deafened, as we say, people who have lost their hearing later in life, senior citizens, the elderly, things like that. And only actually a small percentage are signing deaf people, right? Because I think people think of hearing loss or deafness, and it doesn't always mean signers. But culturally, if you identify as deaf, if you're a member of the deaf community, capital letters D, capital letters C, you're a signer for the most part. And we have a university called Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., the capital of the U.S. And there's been a lot of media attention in the US about sign language. It's become popular, like Joy said. And that's new. And I see progress in that sense. But my experience living in Germany is that I don't have as much access as a deaf person. There's not as much advocacy. And maybe I will say that in Germany, disability rights aren't as strong as they could be. But it has the funding in Germany. The government does support efforts like this financially. But I think because deaf people have a lot of government support, unlike in the US, people are happy with the amount of rights that they have, even though they're not full rights. Whereas in the US, we don't have government support. So we are fighting all the time for every right we can have. I think that I can say that the quality of life in Germany is amazing. It is true. But if I don't have access to everything, then how much of access do I have to a good quality of life? The US has that access because we've had to fight for it, because we want to fight for it, because our government won't fight for it. Mm-hmm. I think that the US, the American deaf community, has been shaped by laws. We have laws to protect disability rights. And I think having that allows people to follow or make sure that people do follow the laws, which give us better education in the US at least, which allow deaf people to be better activists. Mm-hmm. So I know I've thrown a lot at you, but there's a lot to think about there.
For example, I mean, rights for access to education, I think makes sense. But what are some other examples of rights that you fought for and gotten, and then rights that you're still trying to get?
I appreciate that. Okay. So in the US, we have this law called the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed in the year 1990. I was 10 years old at that time. And I remember that law taking action very clearly. Like, I remember in school, all of a sudden I had a note taker. All of a sudden there was captions on TV programs. Commercials had captions. I had never seen anything like that. And then I got to college. I went to a university where there are a large number of deaf students, which means that there were many interpreters. And then I went to a private art school where there were no other deaf students in New York. They told me that I would have to pay for half of the interpreter's fees as a student. And I thought, me? You think I have money to pay for interpreters? Are you kidding? I'm a student. So I used the law. I wrote a letter to the provost and I said, there's this law called the ADA. while I'm not good at lawyering up, as we say, I know that you have obligations to this law. And they decided that they'd rather not deal with lawyers and legal issues and just follow the law. So they brought in an interpreter for me to access school full time. And that for me was the first time I experienced having to ask for my rights in a way, but also experiencing the law being on my side. And if we didn't have the ADA, I'd probably have gone to a different school and maybe I would have settled for less.
Mhm. Interesting. I think that we have some politicians involved in this neurodiversity salon, and I do think that laws are tremendously important. I'm curious whether you think the US laws are generally ahead of the rest of the world, like Germany. I don't know if you know about Japan, and whether there's a global movement around the deaf community or if it's just kind of local in each country.
So, in my experience, the deaf communities are quite separate historically. I think now we're starting to see the deaf communities work together globally, but that's pretty new. There are some youth programs that are global deaf youth programs or regional deaf youth programs, like in Europe. So I am seeing a change towards unity. And I think part of that is because the signing community is becoming smaller, right? We're seeing less people learning sign language somehow. And I think when you feel like your community is getting smaller, you start looking outside for other people like you. I'm not an expert, but like one example is the film Crip Camp. It was a documentary film, and it films a camp of disabled people in the 60s, 1960s and 1970s. It was produced by former President Obama. That's something maybe you'd see that elsewhere, but this is something that shows the activism in the US being ahead, maybe. I will say that the American government is a newer government. We know this. We're also a country full of immigrants, right? So there's always been tension and differences between the groups. And so I think that has made Americans more open to adapting to otherness and newness and difference. Whereas many other countries are much older than the US and they have historical patterns and they're set that way. And so it's harder for them to change or to adapt. So I guess in that sense, you can say that the US is a little bit more advanced when it comes to disability rights and laws. But the American government feels really fragile to me right now. We could have a president who could take us backwards very quickly.
Mhm. When you were at the Media Lab, you mentioned that sign language was one of the major languages, but it still wasn't taught in school. I remember you told me what rank it was or how many people. I'm just trying to remember that fact. And then, yeah.
In colleges, it's like the top most popular foreign language to learn. I don't know if that's still the case in 2023,
but considering that many colleges don't teach it still, right? Are they teaching it?
Sure. Yeah, they are teaching it. Like
Okay.
some do. And I think those numbers are increasing, like you said, at MIT.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is the deaf rights of students or employees at that same university might not be there.
Mhm.
Right. And so I think it's important that people see deafness and deaf people as a regular part of society, an everyday thing. I think once we have that regular visibility
Mhm.
where people say, oh, yeah, I've met a deaf person, or yes, I know a deaf person, or oh, I know a little bit of sign language. When that kind of attitude is common, then
Mhm.
I think we'll see rights for deaf people
Yeah.
become stronger.
And for what it's worth, this is one of the key things of our neurodiversity salon. Japan was criticized by the United Nations last year for segregating people with disabilities so you can't see them. And I think being together and having disabilities as part of the normal life is essential part of understanding this. Um,
I wholeheartedly agree. Exactly.
and I also remember when I was at TED with Christine, somebody kept bringing a new technology to help deaf people hear spoken words. And I remember Christine saying, wow, another technology to let me hear what you're saying doesn't help me tell you what I want to say. And I'm, I'm curious, how Christine has looking at technology these days, and if there's any particular technology that she feels is helpful for deaf rights.
I'm thinking. So there's technology around making more interpreters available online, like this Zoom call, or there's been more government support to have access to interpreters be free. That technology is the technology I'm interested in,
Mm.
right? Because that covers my very basic right of having access to communication. But even that's not fully secured. But you're right, Joy. You don't know how many young, straight, white men love coming up with new technology, they think. But it never lasts, does it? I've never seen it work, right? These technologies get so much funding. People are like, look, I have signing gloves. Or look, I have this app. It never works. And they test on us like we're animals, right? For their own idea. For me, I think we need to do better.
Mhm.
I struggle with the idea of kind of integrating, if you will. I do think it's important that deaf and hearing people interact and have relationships and are part of the same community. But there's something special about being around people who have the same language as you
Mm.
and having that security, knowing that you're growing up in a place where people understand you. That way you can develop your identity. And even in the disability community, deaf people are kind of segregated from the rest of the disabled community. I think historically there's been tensions between the label of disabled and deaf. I think that relationship has gotten better. But I will say the schools for the deaf, where they are places where children use sign language and learn from deaf teachers and things like this, are a great thing. I don't always think that deaf children need to be at public hearing schools. And sorry to kind of not answer your question, but I just wanted to maybe address these basic things.
No, that's very interesting. I've been starting to do work in technology for autistic children. And in a very similar way, you see all kinds of biases built into the technology. The idea that autistic children are like machines or robots, and trying to program them like they program a computer. And I think that it reminds me of your earlier conversation about as a child, where the researchers are poking you like an experiment. um, and I think that also, maybe, as you said, that there's some, maybe technology comes from the community, from the deaf community. And I'm curious if there are any things that you see being designed by the community.
So most members of the deaf community haven't had full access to education, right? So the innovation as a result of not having full access to education lacks. Like, I think that deaf people need to have full access to education and have the same privileges as any other hearing student.
Mhm.
Once we see that happen, I think you'll see a huge number of deaf inventors.
Mhm.
But because deaf children don't get equal access to education,
Mhm.
there aren't that many inventors right now that are also deaf. I think that maybe a downside about that is that we also become too obsessed on protecting ASL and proving that it's a real language. Because we put our efforts into that, we miss having the ability to play around. Like, every time I would go to Media Lab, I always felt envious of all of these people who get to play around with an idea, right? They didn't have budgetary restrictions. They didn't have access restrictions. We need something like that in the deaf community.
Mhm.
The ability to play, because when you can play, you can come up with new ideas, new solutions. Maybe we could stop a war, you know?
Is access to education the most important, right? Do you think?
Yeah, number one,
Mhm.
no hesitation. And it's full access to their language from birth and then in education. Because most deaf children don't have access to sign language until later on when they're maybe school aged.
Mhm.
But we know that there's a window, a certain amount of time that children can acquire language successfully,
Mhm.
and school age is a little bit too late. And also, a lot of early years are spent looking for their members of community instead of being in the community.
Mhm. Mhm.
Like, if you really think about this, it's a little weird how hearing people just so want to make us like them.
Mhm.
Like, I have taken speech therapy classes. I did it for many years. And honestly, it messed me up. It was not for my benefit. All day, they told me I was wrong. You're saying this wrong. That's not right. And I was a kid. So every day as a kid, I was told, no, you're wrong. That's not right. You messed up. You can't do this, right? That impacts you and how you feel about yourself and how you think about yourself. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge how much power hearing parents have.
Mhm.
And so the first group we need to work with are hearing parents.
Mhm.
Of course, I'm a mother myself, and I wish my kid to be like me too. But she's not, right? And so I have to accept that because she can hear and I don't,
Mhm.
she'll never be like me.
Mhm.
And that's okay too. You have to accept that.
Mhm. Very interesting. There are many similarities with autism and parenting as well that I think is the key thing we need to change is culture and thinking of parenting, I think. Um, Earlier, you used the word ableism and ableist, and I kind of know what it means, but I think for everybody, maybe sharing what the word ableism means. I don't know if it exists in Japanese. I'd be curious from the Japanese too, but maybe describe the word and explain the issue around it.
Sure, I'm happy to. So, ableism, the noun, means, well, let me start over. It comes from the idea of disability and ability, which is where ableist comes from, having ability. So it's the idea that those people who have the ability to hear, to see, to be mobily free, non-neurodivergent, right? All those people are superior and are also the standard at which society should function and should be held to, which can't be. And it also has the view of disability being something unable, right? And for a long time, I was uncomfortable with the word disabled. I felt I'm not disabled, I'm deaf. And thinking that disability was something almost bad. But the truth is now the word disabled has a bigger meaning, has incorporated more communities, and it's not just one way to be disabled any longer. You can be disabled in so many different ways, and it's not bad, right? That's all the good shit, as we say. And so for me, I think ableism is this belief that disability is less good, that you can oppress people for being disabled, you can discriminate against people who are disabled, because there are people who are abled, who are better, and can do things right. It's kind of the same idea as racism. One race is better than another race. So ableism is based off of disability and ability, and racism is based off of a superior race and an inferior race as a concept.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in for autism, we often talk about neurotypical, and there's a very funny joke page calling it neurotypical syndrome about people who think about the sort of superiority of neurotypicals. But it is a affliction, I think, that many cultures have, and I think very strong in Japan still, this ableism. And let me see, let me do a time check. So I know you said that that you don't see as much technology, but you use technology quite a bit, right, Christine? You tried NFTs. I know we text a lot, but I mean, what is your relationship with NFT? What is your relationship with technology, and how are you? I mean, do you like technology, or because I know you said that the deaf community is a little bit adverse to technology, but how are you personally?
So you're right. There's some technology that deaf people have gotten really into and embraced, and some technologies less so. Personally speaking, I think that there are a lot of new deaf DAOs,
Mm-hmm.
and that's kind of increased. And I think it's important to, I don't know, I think have that engagement, right? To have those kind of tools. So to me, NFTs are great because it's a lot about autonomy,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
having independence from being able to make your own, right? Create your own value, create your own money. And you've seen some people really take off in that way. So I feel like that's been a good step for me, and I do hope to see more of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it kind of comes down to autonomy and self-created value in any sense. I think that's what I respond to. To share, I think Gallaudet University, that deaf university I mentioned in Washington, D.C. Give me a moment. I'm going to look for a statistic for you.
And just to the audience while we're waiting for Chris. Oh, go ahead. No, go.
Sure. So So research shows that American Sign Language has a value in total. So whether it's the cost of education in sign language, paying for interpreters, all of that as an entity is valued at about 10 billion US dollars. But how much of that value is the deaf community getting? Well, I can answer that for you. Not a lot. A lot of hearing people are profiting off of ASL and making most of that 10 billion US dollars. And so with technologies like NFTs, I do hope to see deaf people reclaiming back more of that value of their language.
Mhm. Interesting. And I do, since we last met, I've been spending a lot more time on autism, but the more I listen, the more similarities I see and the challenges. And I'm curious if you see, you said there was some like separation between deaf community and other disabilities, but it seems like working together is very important. What do you think the challenges are and maybe the opportunities are to work across different types of disabilities? And because the neurodiversity salon, that's sort of our focus as well.
I think there are a lot of benefits of working together. Again, like I said, I feel like the definition and community of being disabled has expanded a lot in the last 15 years. Like sometimes I have a hard time accepting you're disabled too. Oh, you're a member of the disabled community, right? Like chronic illness is considered a disability, but there's short-term disability, long-term disability. There's physical disability and sensory disabilities. There's also intellectual disabilities, right? And so there's so many different members that sometimes I feel like I don't even now understand what disability means. We also have post-traumatic stress disorder considered as a disability in the US. So it does beg the question of how nuanced do you want disability to be?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I feel a little old school where I'm like, disabled means deaf, blind, wheelchair users, and that's it. But that's not true. And I think that that's good. And I think that being able to have more members of the community allow for us to incorporate more ideas, more solutions. And when we work together, it really allows us to make progress. I always feel like in some ways we'll always be our own different groups under one umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of magic will happen if we work together more.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, maybe we could stop wars.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's interesting because the solidarity somebody mentioned, Manai, in the chat, but a lot of solidarity comes from having a common identity. But I think that the key is to make diversity the identity, because actually, in fact, no one in the world is normal, and everyone has some disability. And I think it's very difficult to organize with this kind of amorphous thing. And so I think it's kind of a philosophical shift in how identity works. I think it's quite complicated but achievable. And I think it's because the world has created identity more through division, and you identify with sameness. I think it's really an interesting identity question that maybe we need to tackle. It's a complicated idea, but Christine, you reach so many people through your art that I think art and other sorts of identity that cut across different sensibilities is maybe a place to start.
I agree. I will say that maybe I can bring up this classic example now of how society and disability have this relationship through objects. So, for example, I feel like people with glasses are accepted in the sense that we know everyone has different kind of vision, right? There's nearsighted, farsighted, and all people who wear glasses are accepted. Glasses are even fashionable now for some people, right? You can have status glasses. So why doesn't that apply to other disabilities? Why aren't hearing aids treated that way? Why aren't walking canes being treated this way? How can we make other objects of disability like glasses? And why isn't it that any technology we use as people who are disabled become a status thing too? Like, look at what app I have, right? Like, historically, people who wear glasses are thought to be smart, to be wise,
Mhm.
to be clever. And I want that to be done for other disabilities as well. And I also think it's a good place to start.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of it is in design. I think there are many products like the Segway or Google Glass that didn't become popular. I think partially because they don't look cool, and so maybe we need to have designers and artists more involved in the development of these tools as well. Um, so
I like
I'm gonna start taking some questions. We have about 30 minutes left. So one question was from Dom Kim, and she was asking, if expressions are such an important part of your sign language, um, was it a challenge to communicate during COVID? And what was it like? Um, and did it change the way you do sign language, maybe?
So in the beginning of the pandemic, it did give me more anxiety because I couldn't figure out if somebody was trying to talk to me even or not. Right? Like, I can't see if your mouth is moving, so I can't figure out if you're talking to me or not, right? I don't have access to that information. So it made me a little bit more anxious. But also, people seem to forget. Like, I would tap somebody on the shoulder and I'd write to them and they would kind of talk back to me, but I couldn't tell whether they were saying something or not. So in the pandemic, I remember having to say really clearly via text or writing down, please text or please gesture. But I didn't stay in that state. I eventually just adapted. But also, you maybe have seen some of the innovation around masks. There are a bunch of clear masks where you can see the mouth. I'm not really a fan of that because you could see their breath fogging up, and I just thought of bacteria, so I was not a fan of those. But I almost, at this point, have forgotten how masks have affected communication, but it just required me signing maybe a little bit more clearly or more succinctly, specifically. But at this point, I've kind of forgotten how masks have impacted us.
Hmm. So another question from Manai Makiko. She's also deaf, and she's asking if, I guess, to compare US and Germany, and whether you can find great sign language interpreters like Beth in Germany.
No, is my answer. Part of it is that in Germany, they use German Sign Language. So you need to have an American move to Germany and learn German Sign Language in a way, or maybe somebody who lives in Germany already has American parents and has access to that. So one of the reasons I am now in London and accepted the art residency here in London is because I know 2 American Sign Language interpreters who moved from the US to London for themselves and work here. So I knew I could work with them. So unless an event or some kind of gathering has the budget ready to pay for interpreters to fly from the US, I don't have this kind of access. So it requires a lot of negotiation on my end. But ultimately, to answer your question, Beth is also irreplaceable. Like, I'm very close to Beth. She's one of the few core interpreters that I work with from the US that I work with regularly.
Thank you, Beth. There's another question from Aki Oba, who was asking, how are you balancing work and child rearing? Thank you in advance.
Sorry, Beth maybe dropped that for a moment because she was looking for the name. Oh yeah, so name Aki Oba.
Yes.
Okay, so first of all, I manage it because I have a wonderful teammate. My husband is a great turn taker, as you can see me signing here. We are partners for 10 years, and in those 10 years, I have almost never cooked. I'm lazy. And we do split the child rearing responsibilities. When I travel away for work, he watches our daughter. And then when he travels away for work, I watch our daughter. So we take turns, and we balance that. And then also, it does really help to be in Germany as a mother, because in Berlin, most childcare is free at no cost to me. So I don't need to earn that cost of childcare. And we don't have that in the US. So it is very rare for me as an artist to be able to develop my career and be a mother and also increase my bank account, right? And to still have money. So because of the German government supporting families, and I have a wonderful teammate and my partner, I'm able to make it work. That's how I balance being a mother and being an artist.
Yeah, that sounds like an answer regardless if you're deaf or not. No, but I agree.
True.
So there's a Joseph sent a bunch of questions in one message, but I'll just pick the top one, which is he's curious how the deaf community is responding to ChatGPT. I don't know if you've used ChatGPT and whether it's being helpful in ways like it seems to be helping many people right now.
So I was actually just talking about this with a few American deaf friends of mine. And I think ChatGPT is really interesting. And I think it's interesting because you type something. Of course, it's an AI response to whatever's available on the internet that it gets its data from. And you can see that it's so careful in its responses. I've even asked questions like, are deaf or hearing people better? Right? And the ChatGPT says, I'm not an expert in this field. I understand different perspectives. It depends on how you were raised, what language you use. But any question about disability or deafness, I have noticed that ChatGPT is very cautious and gives a very safe answer. And I think that's really interesting. And so I kind of read Joseph's comment in addition to you reading it out loud.
Mm.
And some of the question is about literacy.
Mhm.
And that kind of speaks back to my point that there isn't a standard for deaf children worldwide when it comes to education.
Mhm.
It varies. And so I'm not really sure what the best way to connect deaf people to technology that requires the ability to read and or write,
Mhm.
which is why I always come back to the most basic right being education. As you asked me, I do
Mhm.
think it starts
Mhm.
there.
I was just before this call playing with a generative video AI, and I think there will be quite soon machines that can understand sign language and also possibly display sign language. So I think that, these machines will make education more accessible to everyone. And so hopefully we can work on things there. And I think, as you say, Christine, the funding and the political will to support disabilities is where it starts. And I think the technology follows the money in many cases. And so that's one of the things we're trying to do, is to bring technology and learning and disabilities together. I've been focusing on autism, but maybe this is a good opportunity for us to try to include the deaf community as well, if you can help us connect to them.
I appreciate that. I also think it's important to bring in local members of the Japanese deaf community in those efforts, because they're able to give you a better perspective on what resources are available
Yeah.
in your area. And that applies to everyone.
Yes, I will reach out to the local community, but if you have any connections through the international community, that would be very helpful.
You got it. I will.
Um, We had another question about, so this is from Akihisa. You can read this too, maybe, but he's a deaf student interested in the collaboration between deaf art and media art. And then the question he has, though, is as the deaf community is getting smaller and smaller, um, but what do you think is an important factor? What would you say?
Does this question mean the deaf community in the US or any deaf community?
I'm not sure. Maybe he means your deaf community. Why do you think it's getting smaller, maybe?
I think I don't fully understand what the question is.
Yeah, I think the question is, yeah, I think he thought that you said the deaf community is getting smaller. And I think the question is, maybe, do you know why?
Sure, I can answer that question. So, where I grew up in the US is in the state of California, south of Los Angeles, in a place called Orange County. And in a town called Irvine, Irvine, they had one deaf high school, if you will. But it was actually a small deaf school in a public high school with hearing students. So what they did is they brought deaf students from all over the area on those yellow school buses, and we all came to this public high school. And for me, it was the best of both worlds because I had my deaf program, and my graduating year had like 32 deaf students, but we were part of a public high school that had 500 students in my graduating year. So we were a small deaf percentage of an overall hearing population at school. But we had students who traveled to the school, like I said, on yellow school buses. What I see now is many parents don't want their kids to travel very far to be with other deaf students. They want their kids to go to their local school, which is fine. But if you're the only deaf student in your entire school and your access is through interpreters, it's very lonely. It's very isolating. And it also depends on your personal circumstances. So I'm not going to say a lot about the cochlear implant industry in the US, at least, but I will say that they're very powerful and they have a lot of money and they're very active. And as a result of of students not going to deaf schools and getting cochlear implants, we just see the signing deaf community getting smaller. I think cochlear implants are being sold as an easy solution that solves everyone's problems, but it's not. It requires the kid, a child, to put a lot of effort into learning, going to speech therapy, getting all of this work done, and everyone else just kind of waits for that to take effect.
I won't make any judgment on cochlear implants, but I will say in autism, there is a lot of effort that has gone into trying to cure autism, or to make autistic kids indistinguishable from normal. But I think a lot of the modern autism movement is about being autistic and embracing that identity and creating self-advocacy of autism. And we're very behind in Japan in that sense. But I do think that, Christine, what you're saying is the more progressive approach that I would like to spread here, is the sort of embracing the difference rather than trying to make everyone appear normal.
I agree. Absolutely. Exactly.
And I guess that's the ableist issue, right? Yeah.
It shows up again. Yes.
Yeah. So there's.
Well, did you see that Ravi also had a comment about avatars and avatar technology in New Zealand? Because you said maybe eventually these machines will be able to sign back. And Joy, I'm not sure if you remember, but I introduced you to my friend Ravi. That's who's commenting here. And the website is kara.tech or kara.tech. And I can say that I've seen that and it kind of blew my mind, because oftentimes when we see avatars in sign language, a lot of the avatars are of a cartoon nature, right? And the features of a person aren't quite there. But this new technology from New Zealand, I got confused. I was like, is this a real person? Right? Is this a deaf person? I do feel like it's been a huge step forward in that technology coming from New Zealand. So it's definitely worth a look, which is why I'm flagging it right now.
Yeah.
So it's from Robbie's comment, if you can find it.
I saw that. That's amazing. So you're supportive of this technology. It's a good step.
Yeah, I think it's a good step. They finally found a way to make it feel authentic. Like they've been able to capture a lot of the nuanced features of sign language. A lot of people think sign language is merely the production of hands, but it's not. It's what you produce on your face and what you produce on your hands and the connection between those at the same time. And this technology I've seen the best done the best, and maybe you should invest in it, Joy.
There's a lot of AI to make AI sound like famous people like Steve Jobs, but I want an avatar that sounds like Christine Sun Kim. Um, so there's a common question from Hiroko Suga. It's also, you can read this, but she's asking how supporters or people outside the community can connect and join, kind of like LGBTQ allies. It's difficult, I think, for, at least in Japan, for people to join the deaf community because they can't sign.
Oh yeah, we have a lot of allies, like LGBTQIA allies, and you see that in educators, interpreters. But I will say that the thing is, oftentimes a lot of allies frame it as themselves.
Mhm.
Hi, I'm an ally and I represent the deaf community. No. One example I'm thinking of is when you go to music concerts in the US, there are a lot of interpreters. And you'll see those concert interpreters who are hearing go viral online, right? And then people want to interview those interpreters. And those hearing interpreters say, yeah, look at me, I can sign. Yes, exactly, excuse me, virtue signaling. It is that, like, look at what I can do, but that's not what an ally is supposed to do. It's interesting because interpreters get a lot of compliments for knowing sign language, but I, a native sign language user, are not getting compliments for using sign language. I grew up signing. I'm actually the more native, more beautiful signer. So the allyship is important. It's great. But I think because of how we communicate, it's just so easy to kind of lose our place. And that space gets taken by hearing people really easily as a result. So you just have to be conscious as an ally of that. Of course, you can join the deaf community, but I also want to say don't impose yourself on the deaf community. Don't take away space, right? If you find deaf friends and you make that connection, good job. That's great, right? But any kind of money or attention that you can bring to the deaf community as an ally should go through us first
Mhm.
and not through you.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean,
Yes,
it,
exactly.
and it is difficult because of the cost and the numbers to communicate. And one of the things I think that was uh, an opportunity with the Media Lab is we had the funding and the time and the energy to bring Christine into our community and inspire us. But it does require intent and structure. And I hope, and as we sort of wrap up today, I hope that a lot of our community members, I think, were inspired today. And I know some of your community members also joined Christine. And I think this Caro website is tremendous. So I'm going to look into that. But I really do hope that maybe we can use this as an opportunity to start a collaboration again, both Japan and the West, but also the different disabilities. And we have a lot of technical people, and so maybe we can try to figure out a way to work together. I think our community members also have a ability to activate. So maybe we can follow up both online and other places. I really do want to make this more than just a single presentation. And also, I think that you shared how to do this technology today with the sign language and the interpreters, and I think it went pretty well. I wonder if all of the uh, signing people can show your faces, because I think you guys, even though Christine doesn't want me to um, flatter the interpreters, I think today they did an amazing job. And Beth without even having a person switch. I don't know if we can get everyone, the interpreters, to show their faces and give them some applause.
Well, in this instance, I do support applauding the interpreters.
I know when Christine came to the Media Lab, the interpreters were always very tired by the end of the day because she has so much energy. But I also want to reach out to both the audio as well as the sign language interpreters. We do want to try to do this kind of thing more. And so if you have feedback on how to improve, and maybe if you know the deaf community in Japan, maybe you can share this video and see if they can join us. And maybe we can have maybe a more hands-on workshop-like follow-up to this meeting. Christine, if you're interested, it would be an honor for us. I think this might be a good start and a good video to share to people who want to understand the movement. And we need to get you to Japan after you have your second baby.
Yes, please. Well, and it's funny because Beth is flying to Japan tomorrow, so she'll be there tomorrow.
Oh, well, Beth.
But I'm sad that I can't join her.
well, Beth, please do give us a ring.
Oh, thank you, Joy.
And we'll send some pictures to her.
Augustine says, arigato, thank you so much for this. I really do appreciate it.
So thank you very much. And Christine, do you have something, any last comments before we wrap up?
Well, I do want to say to you, Joy, and to your team, you guys have been amazing. Like figuring out how to bring in spoken language, sign language, multiple sign languages, multiple spoken languages. Ultimately, your team did a great job. I know there was a lot of effort included in this, but once you do it like we did today, it becomes easier in the future. And I hope to see more of this. Mm-hmm. And I just want to say thank you for having me, for inviting me to be a part of this today. And I do hope to come and see you in Japan in person soon, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's maybe include members of our community in the next one of these sessions. Thank you very much.
Yes. Yes, please.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. I'm signing off now.